Welcome to Wars and Dusk. Tonight, we journey to the final days of a crumbling Reich, where one German sergeant quietly set down his weapon, defied a direct order, and may have shortened the deadliest war in human history. If history's greatest conflicts are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the past carry you to sleep. Settle into wherever you are resting tonight. Let your breath find its own quiet rhythm. There is a story waiting for you, a story about a single man, standing at a crossroads in the dark, holding a decision that history would later call extraordinary. He had no way of knowing what would follow. He only knew what he had seen, and what he could not bring himself to do. Let that thought rest softly with you as we begin. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a battlefield when the fighting has paused. Not the silence of peace, nothing so gentle as that, but the silence of exhaustion, of men too tired to speak, of machines gone cold in the mud, of the space between one terrible moment and the next. It is in that kind of silence that the most consequential decisions of war are often made. Not in grand headquarters lined with maps and medals, but in the field, by men whose names the history books sometimes struggle to remember. This is a story about one of those men. His name was Feldwebel, Sergeant Johann Schlemmer. He was not a general. He was not a decorated hero of the kind whose portraits hang in museums. He was a career soldier from a modest Bavarian town, a man who had served the German military through some of its darkest and most complicated years. By the final autumn of the Second World War, he had seen enough to last several lifetimes. And yet there he stood, somewhere in the collapsing Western Front of Nazi Germany, with an order in his hand and a choice before him that would, in the end, contribute to bringing the war to an earlier close than anyone had anticipated. But before we reach that moment, before we stand beside Schlemmer in the dark, we must understand the world that made him. We must understand what Germany looked like in those last months of a war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives. We must understand the structure of command that made his disobedience not merely unusual, but genuinely dangerous. And we must understand why, in the spring of 1945, the bridges of a single German river became among the most important pieces of military infrastructure on the entire continent of Europe. The year was 1945. The month was March. Germany, as a military and political entity, was fragmenting. The armies of the Soviet Union had crossed the Vistula in January and were grinding westward through Poland and into Prussia itself, while in the south, Allied forces had penetrated through Italy and were pressing northward. On the Western Front, the front that concerns us most directly tonight, the armies of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and their allies had pushed out of France, through Belgium and Luxembourg, and were now pressing against the Rhine River, the great natural barrier that Hitler and his commanders had declared must be held at all costs. The Rhine. Even the name carries a kind of weight. It is one of the great rivers of Europe, wide, fast-moving, cold, a river that has marked boundaries and defined civilizations for 2,000 years. In Roman times, the Rhine was the edge of the known world, the boundary beyond which lay the dangerous forests of Germania. In the spring of 1945, it was the last significant natural obstacle standing between the Allied armies and the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler had ordered that every bridge across the Rhine be destroyed before Allied forces could reach them. This was not merely a tactical decision, It was a directive that carried the full weight of Nazi ideology and the Führer's increasingly desperate belief that Germany could still fight its way to some kind of negotiated survival, or at minimum, that it could bleed the Allies sufficiently to alter the terms of any eventual peace. Every bridge that fell into Allied hands intact was, in Hitler's view, a betrayal. And the penalty for betrayal in the Germany of 1945 was death. The officers and soldiers charged with demolishing these bridges knew this. They had seen what happened to men who failed Hitler. Flying courts-martial, tribunals that could convene, judge, and execute a soldier within hours, were operating throughout the retreating German army. Signs were hung from the necks of hanged men at crossroads and bridges, reading, "I was too cowardly to defend my fatherland." The message was unmistakable. Failure to obey meant death. And yet one bridge was not destroyed. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a railway bridge spanning the Rhine between the small German towns of Remagen on the western bank and Erpel on the eastern, was captured intact by American forces on the afternoon of March 7, 1945. It would prove to be one of the most significant military events of the entire European campaign. The story of how that bridge remained standing is a story of miscommunication, of panic, of the fog of war, and of at least one man, perhaps more, who looked at the order to destroy his position and chose, in that critical moment, to hesitate. The story involves Sergeant Schlemmer, yes, but also a young American officer named Karl Timmerman, the son of a German immigrant, who led the first troops across that bridge under fire. And it involves the commanding generals on both sides who suddenly found themselves confronting a situation that none of their careful planning had anticipated. Tonight, we will trace that story from its roots, through the political catastrophe that made such a moment possible, through the military campaigns that brought two exhausted armies to the banks of the Rhine, through the individual decisions of men under impossible pressure, and then beyond it, to the consequences that rippled outward from one undemolished bridge, and one sergeant who did not quite do what he had been told. There is no single hero in this story, and no simple villain. There is only the terrible complexity of war, and within it, the occasional appearance of something that looks almost like grace. Let us begin. To understand why a single bridge mattered so enormously in the spring of 1945, we must first understand the condition of Germany itself. Not the Germany of propaganda posters and torchlight rallies, that Germany had long since dissolved into rubble and ash, but the Germany that actually existed in the final months of the war. A nation that was simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts, being bombed around the clock by fleets of Allied aircraft, running desperately short of fuel and ammunition and trained soldiers, and governed by a leadership that had lost contact with reality and was issuing orders more suited to the first years of the war than to its last. Adolf Hitler, by the winter of 1944 and 1945, was a man whose physical and mental deterioration was visible to everyone around him. He was stooped, his left hand trembled uncontrollably, his complexion was gray and waxy, and he spent most of his time in underground bunkers, surrounded by a shrinking circle of advisors who understood that telling him uncomfortable truths was dangerous. His strategic judgment, always erratic, had become increasingly divorced from the realities on the ground. He continued to order counterattacks with divisions that no longer existed, continued to insist that relief forces would arrive when there were no relief forces to send, continued to believe, or at least to assert, that Germany's enemies would somehow collapse before Germany itself did. The Ardennes Offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, had been Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Launched in December 1944 with the last significant armored reserves available to the German military, it had achieved initial surprise and torn a large salient into the Allied lines. But it had ultimately failed, as every serious German military analyst had predicted it would, consuming irreplaceable men and machines while accomplishing nothing of strategic significance. By late January 1945, the Allied line had been restored, and the German forces that had launched the offensive were badly depleted and in retreat. The effect of this failure on the German military as a whole was profound. Army Group B, responsible for defending the central section of the Western Front including the Rhine crossings in the Rhineland, was a shadow of its former self. Divisions that had once fielded 10,000 or 12,000 men were operating with 3,000 or 4,000. Tanks were short of fuel. Artillery shells were rationed. Experienced officers and NCOs, the backbone of any army, had been killed or wounded in disproportionate numbers over 5.5 years of continuous warfare. The men who remained were a mixed force. There were still dedicated professionals, soldiers who had served since the beginning of the war and who continued to fight with skill and discipline even in the face of obvious defeat. There were conscripts who had been called up in the desperate levies of 1943 and 1944, boys of 16 and 17 alongside men in their 40s and 50s, given minimal training and sent to the front. There were Volkssturm units, the People's Storm, essentially a home militia, equipped with old weapons and almost no training, whose military value was limited but whose presence spoke eloquently to the desperation of the regime. And there were the SS, the ideological backbone of the Nazi state, whose units were generally better equipped and more fanatical than regular army formations, and who served as a form of internal enforcement as much as frontline fighting force. The morale of this army was, by early 1945, deeply fractured. Most soldiers knew the war was lost. The question that occupied their minds was not how to win, but how to survive, how to avoid being killed in the final weeks of a war whose outcome was already determined, how to be captured by the Western Allies rather than the Soviets, how to get home to families whose fate in a bombed and burning Germany was uncertain. And yet the terror of the Nazi state still functioned. Soldiers who deserted, who surrendered without authorization, who failed to hold their positions, they and their families were threatened with severe punishment. The flying courts-martial operated at the front and behind it. SS units and military police patrolled the rear areas, looking for stragglers and deserters. The system of fear that had sustained Nazi Germany for 12 years had not yet entirely broken down, even as everything else was collapsing around it. It was into this environment, this world of exhaustion and terror and approaching collapse, that the Allied armies were pressing. The Allied command structure in the West, under Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had spent much of the winter of 1944 and 1945 debating the best strategy for finishing the war in Europe. The debate, broadly speaking, was between those who favored a concentrated thrust through a single point, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's approach, which called for a powerful drive across the North German plain toward Berlin, and those who preferred a broad advance across the entire front, pressuring the Germans everywhere simultaneously. Eisenhower favored the broad front approach, a decision that caused considerable friction with Montgomery and with the British government, but which reflected his assessment of both Allied and German capabilities. The broad front strategy meant that when the opportunity presented itself at Remagen, it would be seized not as part of a grand plan but as an improvised exploitation of unexpected good fortune. This is sometimes how the most important events of war unfold, not from elaborate planning, but from the meeting of preparation and chance. In the first days of March 1945, the 1st United States Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges, was pushing toward the Rhine along a front that stretched from the Dutch border in the north to the Moselle River in the south. The 9th Armored Division was operating in the center of this advance, moving through the rolling, wooded terrain of the Rhineland with a speed that frequently outpaced supply lines and communications. It was elements of this division, specifically the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion, that would find themselves, on the morning of March 7, approaching the small town of Remagen with no particular expectation of finding anything extraordinary. They were wrong about that. But before we follow those American soldiers down into the Rhine Valley, we must first understand the bridge itself, the Ludendorff Bridge, and the men who had been assigned to defend it. Because the bridge had a history of its own, and the men guarding it were caught in a web of orders and counter-orders that would, in the end, make their impossible situation even more impossible. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was not, by any objective measure, a particularly beautiful structure. It had been built during the First World War, completed in 1918, as a means of moving troops and supplies across the Rhine, a purely functional piece of military engineering named after Erich Ludendorff, the German general who had been instrumental in Germany's war effort in that earlier conflict. By 1945, it was aging and somewhat battered, its railway tracks having seen decades of heavy use, its stone towers and steel lattice structure bearing the accumulated wear of nearly 3 decades. The town of Remagen itself was a quiet place, or had been before the war. Situated on the western bank of the Rhine where the river curves gently between forested hills, it was the kind of small German town that appears on postcards: old stone buildings, a church with a distinctive double-spired tower, a central square, vineyards on the slopes above the river. The war had reached it, as it had reached everywhere in Germany by early 1945, there had been bombing raids, there were soldiers everywhere, and the civilian population was caught between the fear of further Allied attacks and the anxiety of wondering what an Allied occupation would mean. On the eastern bank, connected to Remagen by the bridge and by the quiet fact of proximity, was the smaller settlement of Erpel, backed by a steep rocky bluff called the Erpeler Lay that rose sharply from the river. The bridge's eastern tower was built into the face of this bluff, and a railway tunnel ran through the rock itself, a tunnel that would, in the coming days, serve as a shelter for German troops and equipment, and as an exit that allowed soldiers to survive even as the situation at the bridge became desperate. The bridge had been mined. This was not a last-minute decision, it had been prepared for demolition weeks before, as part of the overall German plan for defending the Rhine. Explosive charges had been placed at critical points on the structure, and the electrical circuits to detonate them had been installed and tested. The plan, in theory, was straightforward: when Allied forces approached closely enough to make the bridge's capture a real threat, it would be blown. The river would remain a barrier. The Allied advance would be delayed. The problem, and it was a problem that would prove fatal to German hopes at Remagen, was that responsibility for the bridge had been passed between multiple commanders in the weeks leading up to March 7, and the chain of command had become tangled in ways that would have disastrous consequences. The German officer most directly responsible for the bridge's demolition in its final hours was Captain Willy Bragg, a combat infantry officer who had been wounded on the Eastern Front and assigned to bridge defense duties while he recovered. Bragg was a professional soldier, capable, conscientious, and deeply uncomfortable with the chaotic situation he found himself in. He had approximately 500 men to defend the bridge and its approaches, a mixed force of regular infantry, Volkssturm militia, anti-aircraft crews, and various soldiers who had been swept up from other units as the front collapsed westward. But Bragg did not have the authority to blow the bridge himself. That authority rested with Major Hans Scheller, an engineer officer who had been assigned to oversee the demolition, and who was supposed to be present at the bridge to give the order when the time came. And above both Bragg and Scheller, the chain of command extended upward through multiple headquarters, each of which had its own priorities and its own communications difficulties in the chaotic final weeks of German resistance in the West. Then there was Feldwebel, Sergeant Karl Roth, who was one of the engineers responsible for the actual detonation of the charges. And it is here that we first encounter the kind of man who will matter most to our story tonight. Because Karl Roth was not Johann Schlemmer, the sergeant whose name appears in the title of our journey tonight, but he was cut from a similar cloth. He was a man who had looked at the situation before him with the practical, ground-level eyes of an experienced soldier, and who had reached conclusions that were very different from those being reached in the headquarters above him. He had looked at the state of the charges, at the complexity of the electrical detonation system, at the fact that the system had been modified and interfered with multiple times by different hands, and he had privately wondered whether it would work at all. A secondary detonation system, a manual fuse, had been prepared as a backup. But even this was not as simple as it sounded. The situation at Remagen in the hours before the American arrival was one of escalating confusion, of orders and counterorders, of the fog of a retreating army that had lost coherent communication and was responding to immediate threats rather than executing any larger plan. Into this confusion, on the morning of March 7, 1945, came the advance elements of the American 9th Armored Division. And among them came a young officer who would make a decision as significant, in its own way, as any made by the Germans at the bridge. His name was First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann. He was 22 years old. His father was a German immigrant who had settled in Nebraska, and Timmermann himself had grown up in that most American of landscapes, the Great Plains, with their vast skies and their particular quality of light. He spoke no German, though German was spoken in his family home. He was by all accounts a serious, capable officer, not a glory seeker, not a reckless man, but someone who understood what needed to be done and was willing to do it. The story of how Timmermann and Schlemmer came to face each other across the span of a bridge, one trying to cross it, one positioned at its far end, is a story that began long before either man was born, in the political currents and strategic calculations that had brought the world to this particular point in time. But it reached its climax in a single extraordinary afternoon, in a small German town on the bank of a cold river, when the fate of the bridge, and with it, perhaps, the final weeks of the war, hung on a series of decisions made by tired, frightened, uncertain men. The movement of American forces toward Remagen in the first week of March 1945 was, on the surface, just another episode in the long, grinding advance that had been pushing eastward since the breakout from Normandy the previous summer. But the pace of that advance had accelerated dramatically in late February and early March, as German resistance in the Rhineland, the region west of the Rhine, began to crumble under the combined pressure of multiple Allied attacks. Operation Grenade, launched in February 1945, had seen the 9th United States Army and the 1st Canadian Army clear the northern portion of the Rhineland in fighting that was brutal and slow through flooded terrain. Further south, the 1st United States Army had been pushing through the Eifel region, the rugged, forested upland that lies west of the Rhine in central Germany, with increasing momentum as German units either gave way or were encircled and destroyed. The soldiers doing this fighting were, by this point in the war, experienced and capable, but they were also tired. Many of the men in the divisions pressing toward the Rhine had been in combat since the Normandy landings of June 1944, or had been replacement soldiers who had joined units that had taken severe casualties in the Hürtgen Forest fighting or during the Bulge. The pace of the advance, sometimes covering 20 or 30 miles in a single day across the open Rhineland countryside, was physically exhausting, and the logistical challenges of keeping armor fueled and infantry supplied over lengthening supply lines created constant uncertainty. But there was also, for the first time in many months, a sense that the end was genuinely near. The German forces they were fighting were visibly deteriorating, surrendering in larger numbers, fighting with less coordination, showing all the signs of an army coming apart. For men who had fought through the terrible winter of 1944 and 1945, this was a meaningful change. There was, alongside the exhaustion, a careful, superstitious hope, the kind of hope that experienced soldiers hold quietly, not wanting to tempt fate, but unable to entirely suppress. The 9th Armored Division had been assigned to take the town of Remagen as part of its advance toward the Rhine. Nobody expected the bridge to still be standing when they got there. Intelligence assessments based on the pattern of German demolitions elsewhere suggested that any bridges still intact as Allied forces approached would be blown before they could be captured. The 9th Armored was told to reach the Rhine, establish contact with the river, and await further orders. What happened next would depend on the enemy. On the morning of March 7, a task force organized around the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann, moved out toward Remagen. It was a gray, cold morning, the kind of early spring morning that carries the memory of winter in its air, when the frost has not quite left the ground and the trees are still bare. The task force moved through the rolling countryside west of the Rhine, passing through villages whose inhabitants watched from windows and doorways with expressions that mixed fear, exhaustion, and something that might, in some faces, have been relief. As the Americans approached the heights above Remagen and the valley of the Rhine came into view, something unexpected happened. A scout in the leading elements reported back to his company commander, and then the company commander reported back to Engemann, and the news traveled up the chain of command with the particular electricity that belongs to unexpected good fortune. The bridge was still there. Standing in the clear morning air, visible through field glasses from the heights above the town, the Ludendorff Bridge spanned the Rhine intact. Traffic was crossing it, German soldiers, vehicles, equipment moving from west to east in a retreat that still appeared to be operating in some kind of order. But the bridge was standing. Engemann's first reaction, shared by everyone around him, was a kind of stunned disbelief. They had not planned for this. There was no order in anyone's orders that said what to do if you arrived at the Rhine and the bridge was standing. The instinct of the professional soldier is to exploit opportunity, But the instinct of the cautious officer is also to check up the chain of command before taking an action with potentially enormous consequences. Engelmann did both, simultaneously. He sent word up to Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, who immediately drove forward to see for himself. And at the same time, he began moving his forces down toward the town and the bridge. General Hogue arrived at the observation point above Remagen and looked through his field glasses at the bridge. He was an engineer officer. He had, in fact, supervised construction projects of considerable scale before the war, and he looked at the bridge with a professional eye. He could see smoke at the far end. He knew the bridge had been prepared for demolition. He understood that every minute he spent thinking about this was a minute in which it might be blown. He gave the order to take the bridge. This was, at one level, an entirely logical decision. At another level, it was an act of considerable audacity for a brigade-level commander. Hogue was ordering an assault across a bridge that was known to be mined, that was defended by an unknown number of enemy troops, that crossed a river that represented the primary defensive line of the German state, and he was doing so without authorization from Corps or Army headquarters. If the bridge blew when his soldiers were on it, or if the assault failed with heavy casualties, he would bear the full weight of that decision. He was willing to bear it. The question was, who would lead the assault? The answer was Karl Timmerman, the young lieutenant from Nebraska. And the answer was also, in its own way, Sergeant Johann Schlemmer, who was, at that moment, on the other side of the river, at the eastern end of the bridge, holding his position and waiting to find out what the world was going to ask of him. The afternoon of March 7, 1945, unfolded with the compressed urgency that belongs to the most critical moments of any military operation. Time, which in war can stretch endlessly through the bored waiting of inactive hours, suddenly contracted to something tight and immediate, every minute carrying the weight of irreversible consequence. On the western bank, American forces were moving into Remagen itself, the town through which access to the bridge ran. The town was not entirely empty. German soldiers were still moving through it, retreating toward the bridge, and small firefights broke out in the streets and among the buildings as the advancing Americans ran into these rearguard elements. Civilians had taken shelter wherever they could find it, in cellars, in the church, in any structure that offered some protection from the bullets and shell fragments that were beginning to move through the town. At the western approach to the bridge, German engineers were still attempting to prepare additional explosive charges. The original mining of the bridge had been done weeks before, but in the chaos of the retreating front, the circuit had been interfered with, repaired, interfered with again, until nobody was entirely certain of its reliability. An attempt was made to detonate the charges. The result was a partial explosion, not the catastrophic demolition that would have dropped the bridge into the Rhine, but a blast that lifted the roadway slightly, damaged some of the structure, and sent a column of smoke and debris into the air visible for miles in every direction. The bridge was damaged. But it was standing. This was the moment, this partial explosion, this failure of the German demolition system, that transformed an already extraordinary day into something genuinely historic. The explosion had been triggered by Captain Brage's authorization, working with Major Scheller, who had arrived at the bridge, using the emergency manual fuse when the electrical circuit had produced nothing. The manual fuse had produced less than hoped. The bridge shuddered and groaned and swayed, but did not fall. In the confusion that followed, the German defenders at the bridge faced a terrible reality. The bridge had not been destroyed. American forces were visibly approaching from the town. The anti-aircraft guns on the bridge towers were firing, and small arms fire from the western bank was beginning to strike the bridge itself. The soldiers defending the structure, those remaining after many had already used the bridge to escape to the eastern bank, were now being asked to hold against a determined assault with forces wholly inadequate to the task. It was in these minutes that Sergeant Johann Schlemmer became a figure of lasting historical significance. Schlemmer was positioned on the eastern side of the bridge, near the eastern tower. His role was, in the broadest terms, to provide covering fire and support for the demolition operation and the rearguard defense. But the demolition had already taken place, incompletely, but the decision to blow the bridge had been made and executed as well as circumstances allowed. Now the question was whether to continue fighting from the bridge structure itself, or to withdraw through the railway tunnel in the Erpelöle and consolidate on the eastern bank. The order Schlemmer had received was to hold his position. To fight. To delay the American crossing for as long as possible. He looked at the bridge. He looked at the American forces now emerging from the town and moving toward the western ramp of the bridge at a run. He calculated, with the rapid arithmetic of an experienced combat soldier, the forces available to him versus the forces approaching, and the structural condition of a bridge that had just been through a partial explosive detonation. He thought about his men, the soldiers under his command, who were also looking at him, waiting for his decision. Schlemmer did not simply abandon his post. That is not what happened, and it is important to be clear about that, because the story deserves accuracy. What Schlemmer did, and what makes his action historically significant, was to interpret his orders in a particular way in the face of circumstances his orders had not anticipated. The bridge demolition had been attempted. The bridge had not fallen. American forces were now on the bridge itself. Lieutenant Timmerman and his men had begun their assault crossing, moving at a run along the bridge deck while German machine gun fire swept at them from the towers above and snipers fired from positions on the eastern bank. Men were being hit. But the momentum of the assault was not stopping. It was at this point that Schlemmer, assessing the situation with the cold clarity of someone who has long since moved past the stage of self-deception, made the decision that history would record. He ordered his men to withdraw. He ordered them back through the tunnel, away from the bridge, into the cover of the Erpelöle. He did not attempt a further demolition. There were, in theory, additional explosive charges that might have been set by hand. There were options, dangerous, uncertain, probably futile options, that a soldier determined to carry out his orders to the absolute letter might have attempted. Schlemmer did not attempt them. Why? That question has occupied historians and military analysts for decades. The question of motivation is always the most difficult question in military history. We can reconstruct what happened from documents, from the accounts of survivors, from the physical evidence of the battlefield. But the internal state of a man in a critical moment, what he felt, what he feared, what he believed, what finally tipped the balance between obedience and the particular kind of disobedience that is not cowardice but something more complex, this we can only approach indirectly. Johann Schlemmer did not leave an extensive memoir. The written record of his own testimony is fragmentary, pieces of interview, a brief account in a post-war deposition, references in the accounts of other soldiers who were present. We must be careful, in reconstructing his thinking, not to impose our own frameworks on his decision, not to make him a hero according to our values when he was simply a man making a judgment in circumstances of extraordinary pressure and uncertainty. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is this. Schlemmer was a professional soldier of long experience. He had served through years of a war that had progressively stripped away the ideological certainties with which it had begun. By early 1945, it required a very particular kind of willful blindness, the kind that the Nazi system actively cultivated and enforced, to believe that Germany could still win the war, or even that continued resistance served any strategic purpose beyond delaying the inevitable. Schlemmer, based on his post-war testimony, had no such illusions. He knew the war was lost. He also knew, and this is perhaps the most humanly significant element of his decision, that the men under his command were young. Some of them very young. The replacements who had filled out German units in the final year of the war included boys who had not yet completed their schooling, men from rear-area jobs who had been thrown into combat with minimal preparation, soldiers who had survived thus far through luck as much as skill, and who had, in Schlemmer's experienced assessment, nothing further to gain from dying on a bridge that American forces were already crossing. The retreat he ordered was, in this light, not so much a disobedience of orders as a reinterpretation of their underlying purpose. The orders existed to delay the Allied advance and preserve German defensive capacity. Sacrificing his men in a firefight on an already compromised bridge would not delay the advance. The Americans were already on the bridge in strength, and the bridge was still standing. It would only add to a casualty count that no longer served any military or strategic purpose. There is another element that deserves mention here, and it is one that speaks to the particular moral landscape of Germany in 1945. Schlemmer, in ordering his men to withdraw, was taking a personal risk that was not small. The Wehrmacht's system of military justice in the final months of the war was, as we have noted, operating in a mode of extraordinary harshness. Officers and NCOs had been shot for lesser failures than this, for retreating without orders, for failing to hold positions, for the kind of pragmatic military judgment that in any rational army would have been recognized as appropriate. Schlemmer must have known this. He must have understood that his decision, if it came to the attention of the wrong people in the right circumstances, could cost him his life. The fact that he made it anyway, quietly, without drama, simply ordering his men back through the tunnel and away from the bridge, suggests something about the character of the man. Not necessarily heroism in the grand theatrical sense, but a kind of quiet moral courage that is, in some ways, more impressive than the dramatic gesture. It is worth noting that Schlemmer was not the only person at Remagen whose decisions contributed to the bridge's survival. The failure of the demolition system was itself the product of multiple decisions, some of them deliberate, some accidental, that had accumulated over the weeks during which the bridge had been prepared for destruction. There is some evidence, though it is difficult to establish conclusively, that at least one German soldier deliberately interfered with the electrical detonation circuit. There is also evidence of simple mechanical failure, of charges that had degraded, of circuits that had been improperly installed or subsequently damaged. The fog of war does not lift entirely, even after decades of research. What we can say is that the bridge's survival was the product of a series of failures and hesitations and choices, layered one upon another, and that among those choices, Schlemmer's decision to withdraw rather than make a final suicidal stand at the eastern end of the bridge was among the most consequential. Meanwhile, on the bridge itself, the American assault was in full progress. What Timmerman did not know, as he ran across that bridge, was that the defenders were already pulling back. That Schlemmer had already made his decision. That the most dangerous moment, a determined last-ditch defense at the eastern tower and tunnel entrance, was not going to happen. He would have reason, in the days that followed, to think about that. Let us slow down here, and follow the crossing itself in some detail. Because what happened on the Ludendorff Bridge on the afternoon of March 7, 1945, deserves to be understood at the level of the individual soldier, the individual second, the individual step taken on a damaged bridge over a cold river with bullets moving through the air. Timmerman's men were from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. They were trained infantry soldiers, but they were riding in half-tracks rather than walking, the armored infantry's mode of advance, and this made them something between pure infantry and mechanized troops. For the bridge crossing, they were dismounted, moving on foot. The bridge deck was wide enough for rail traffic and had a narrow pedestrian walkway on each side. The surface was uneven from the partial demolition. There were places where the boards had been lifted and warped, where the steel framework beneath was exposed, where a man who was not careful might catch his foot and fall. The towers at each end of the bridge were substantial masonry structures, and they were occupied by German soldiers with machine guns who had clear fields of fire along the bridge deck. In the histories of the Remagen crossing that appeared in the decades after the war, most notably in Ken Heckler's book The Bridge at Remagen, published in 1957 and later made into a film, individual soldiers described the experience of the crossing in terms that are vivid and human and worth dwelling on. One soldier described looking at the far end of the bridge and thinking it seemed very far away. Not in miles or meters, he understood the physical distance perfectly well, but in the way that a dangerous space looks when you are required to cross it under fire. The far end seemed to recede, or rather, the act of reaching it seemed to involve more than the simple arithmetic of putting one foot in front of the other. It required something additional, a decision made not once, at the beginning, but continuously, with every step. Another soldier described the strange quality of the fire they were taking. The German defenders, he said, were not shooting with the accuracy or coordination he would have expected. The fire was there, real, dangerous, wounding men, but it was not the organized, overlapping fields of fire that a properly organized defensive position would have produced. It was, he said, the fire of men who were themselves uncertain, who were shooting because they had been ordered to but whose hearts were no longer entirely in the defense of a position they knew was already compromised. This observation, made from the purely practical perspective of a soldier assessing the fire he was taking, is one of the most telling testimonies to the state of the German defense at Remagen. The defenders were not broken, they were still fighting, still causing casualties, but they were fighting in the manner of men who had already internalized the knowledge that they were not going to win this particular engagement. Timmerman himself, in the accounts he gave after the war, was characteristically matter-of-fact about his experience on the bridge. He spoke less about fear than about the practical problems of the crossing, about keeping his men moving, about the need to get to the towers and neutralize the machine gun positions, about the moments when men went down and the question of whether to stop for them or to keep moving. The calculus of the assault crossing requires a terrible pragmatism. You cannot stop for your wounded if stopping means losing the momentum that is your only real protection. American engineers moved onto the bridge alongside the infantry, tasked with finding and cutting the demolition wires, ensuring that no further attempts could be made to blow the bridge while American soldiers were on it. This was hazardous work, requiring men to search the bridge structure for wires and charges while fire was coming from multiple directions. They found cables, they cut cables, they worked with quiet professionalism through an environment that was actively trying to kill them. One of the engineers, Private First Class Joseph Delicio, entered the German-held Western Tower and personally cleared it of its defenders, working his way up through the tower structure, confronting German soldiers at close range, accepting their surrender or firing when they would not surrender, doing what needed to be done with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of effectiveness. This kind of action, small unit, close quarters, entirely dependent on the individual courage and skill of a single soldier, is the texture from which the fabric of larger military events is woven. The bridge did not remain standing because of a grand strategic stroke. It remained standing because a series of men, on both sides of the river, made decisions in real time under extreme pressure. By late afternoon, Timmerman's company had fought its way across the bridge and was in the railway tunnel on the eastern bank, where they found German soldiers sheltering, some of them surrendering, some of them attempting to continue resistance in the darkness. The tunnel fight was brief but sharp, conducted in near-complete darkness with flashlights and muzzle flashes providing the only illumination. Within an hour, the tunnel was cleared. The Rhine had been crossed. The news traveled upward through the American chain of command with the speed of something genuinely extraordinary. Hogue reported to his corps commander, General John Milliken of 3 Corps, who reported to the 1st Army commander, General Courtney Hodges. Hodges initially reacted with disbelief, a bridge intact, men already across, a bridgehead established on the eastern bank of the Rhine? This was not what the day's operational plan had called for. But it was what the day had delivered. Hodges called General Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group. Bradley's response, as recorded in his memoirs, was unambiguous. "Get across," he said, or words to that effect. "And stay across." The capture of the Remagen Bridge sent a tremor through the German command structure that was felt all the way to Hitler's bunker in Berlin. Hitler's reaction, when the news reached him, was volcanic. He was, by this point, prone to rages that had a quality of genuine irrationality, not the calculated, performative fury that had been part of his political toolkit in earlier years, but something that looked more like the breakdown of a man who had built his entire identity on the premise of his own infallibility and could not accommodate evidence of its limits. The bridge's survival was, in his framework, not an accident of war or a product of the chaos of a retreating army. It was a betrayal. He demanded the names of those responsible. He convened a flying court-martial. Officers who had been associated with the bridge defense were arrested, tried in proceedings that lasted hours rather than days, and condemned. Several were executed. Major Hans Scheller, who had been at the bridge for the demolition attempt, was executed by firing squad on March 18, 1945, 11 days after the crossing. He was 32 years old. Captain Willie Bragg was sentenced to death in absentia. He had been captured by the Americans and was in a POW camp, beyond the reach of the court-martial's judgment. He survived the war. Others, officers who had commanded units in the vicinity of the bridge, who had failed to counterattack effectively, who had in various ways failed to undo what the morning of March 7 had done, faced similar proceedings. The machinery of Nazi military justice, stripped of any pretense of proportionality or reason, consumed men who had done what they could in an impossible situation. Schlemmer's fate in this immediate period is less clearly documented. He was not among those immediately arrested, which may speak to the confusion of the German command in the days following the crossing, or to the fact that his role as an NCO rather than a commissioned officer placed him somewhat below the level at which responsibility was being assigned. The German military system was, in many ways, designed to concentrate accountability at the officer level, and the flying court-martial was primarily interested in officers. But the German response to Remagen was not limited to punishment. It also included a genuine military counter-effort, an attempt to destroy the bridge and eliminate the American bridgehead on the eastern bank before it could be reinforced and expanded. Frogmen, German combat swimmers, were sent down the Rhine to attach explosives to the bridge piers. Several were captured. One died in the attempt. The bridge survived. The German counterattacks against the bridgehead on the ground were more serious. German units were scraped together from multiple locations and thrown into attacks against the American perimeter on the eastern bank, attempting to compress and eventually eliminate the bridgehead before it could grow beyond a manageable size. These attacks were persistent and, in places, fierce. American soldiers in the bridgehead fought through several days of continuous pressure, holding a perimeter that grew incrementally but never collapsed. Meanwhile, American engineers worked around the clock to improve the crossing capacity. The Ludendorff Bridge, already damaged and under constant stress from the traffic crossing it, was supplemented by pontoon bridges thrown across the river by combat engineers. The engineering effort at Remagen in the 10 days following the initial crossing was remarkable, one of the finest examples of military engineering under fire in the entire history of the Second World War. On March 17, 1945, 10 days after the capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. The accumulated damage from the original demolition attempt, the German artillery fire, the structural stress of the continuous heavy traffic, and probably some deterioration of the steel that had been there before the battle, all combined to bring it down. Tragically, 28 American engineers were killed when the bridge fell, men who had been working on repairs and reinforcement when the structure finally gave way. But by then, it no longer mattered. The pontoon bridges were in place. The bridgehead was firmly established. The Rhine had been crossed. Within 2 weeks of March 7, the 1st United States Army had put more than 25,000 men and hundreds of tanks and vehicles across the Rhine at Remagen. The defensive line that Hitler had declared must be held at all costs was broken, not at a carefully chosen point after an elaborate assault crossing operation, but at a bridge that should not have been there, defended by men who were already exhausted and uncertain, and that survived by a combination of mechanical failure, human hesitation, and the quiet decision of a German sergeant to take his men and go. The fall of the Remagen Bridge, and the Allied crossing of the Rhine that followed, was not the end of the war in Europe. That is worth remembering, because there is sometimes a temptation in historical narrative to treat a single dramatic event as a simple cause of what follows, when the reality is always more complex, more layered, more dependent on the accumulation of many events and many decisions. The war in Europe continued until May 8, 1945, 2 months after Remagen. In those 2 months, hundreds of thousands of people died. German soldiers, Allied soldiers, Soviet soldiers, civilians of multiple nationalities caught in the path of advancing armies and falling bombs. The war's end, when it came, was still the product of an enormous amount of additional suffering. But what Remagen did, and this is the consensus of the serious historical literature on the question, was accelerate the end by some significant period. Estimates vary. Some historians suggest the war in Europe ended 2 weeks earlier than it would have without Remagen. Others suggest a month. Some go further. The honest answer is that such counterfactual calculations are inherently uncertain. We cannot know with precision what would have happened on a different timeline. But the directional conclusion is widely accepted: Remagen shortened the war. And a shorter war meant, in concrete human terms, fewer deaths. The strategic significance of the Remagen crossing operated at several levels. Most immediately, it provided the Allies with a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine that disrupted German defensive planning across the entire front. German units that had been positioned to resist assault crossings at other, better prepared points now had to be redirected to deal with the threat in their rear. German reserves, already inadequate, were consumed in the counterattacks against the bridgehead rather than being available to resist the larger Allied operations that were being prepared. At the operational level, the Remagen crossing enabled the encirclement of Army Group B in the Ruhr, the great industrial heartland of Germany, which took place in late March and early April 1945. First United States Army broke out from the Remagen bridgehead and drove east and northeast, while the 9th United States Army drove south and east from its Rhine crossing further north, and the two armies met at Lippstadt on April 1, completing an encirclement that trapped more than 300,000 German soldiers, among the largest encirclements of the entire war. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, refused to surrender and eventually shot himself on April 21, unable to reconcile his sense of military honor with the reality of his position. The encirclement of the Ruhr, and the subsequent collapse of German resistance in the West, made the war's end a matter of weeks rather than months. At the psychological level, Remagen had an effect on both sides that was harder to quantify but not less real. For the Allied soldiers who heard about it and saw it happen, it was confirmation that the German military was not going to mount the kind of last-ditch defense of the Rhine that had been feared, that the war was genuinely in its final stages. For German soldiers, the news that the Rhine had been crossed was, for many, the final dissolution of any remaining hope. Surrender rates increased in the weeks following Remagen. Units that had been fighting with grim determination began to disintegrate. In Berlin, in the bunker where Hitler spent his final weeks, the news from the West was one of many disasters arriving in rapid succession. Soviet forces, having crossed the Oder River in January, were approaching the city from the east. The Ruhr was encircled. Allied forces were advancing toward the Elbe. The political structure of the Nazi state was collapsing as Gauleiters and party officials fled their positions or surrendered to the first Allied soldiers they found. Hitler himself, increasingly disconnected from reality, continued to issue orders and demand counterattacks until almost the very end. On April 30, 1945, Hitler died by suicide in his bunker. His political testament blamed others for the failure of his war. He accepted no responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. It was entirely in character. The surrender of Germany came on May 8, 1945, signed at Reims and then ratified in Berlin. The war in Europe was over. The men who had fought at Remagen, on both sides, were scattered by then. Some were dead. Some were in hospitals. Some were in prisoner-of-war camps. Some had already been discharged and were making their way home, or attempting to find what was left of their homes in a continent that had been physically and morally shattered. Timmerman survived the war. He was celebrated for his role in the Remagen crossing, received the Distinguished Service Cross, and returned to Nebraska. He died in 1951, at the age of 29, of a cancer that may or may not have had a connection to his wartime service. He was, by all accounts, modest about his role, a soldier who had done what was in front of him to do, and who did not spend the rest of his life trading on it. Schlemmer's post-war life is documented in fragments. He returned to Bavaria. He spoke, occasionally and with apparent reluctance, about his decision at Remagen. He did not present himself as a hero. He was, in this, entirely consistent with the character of the decision he had made, practical, human, without theatrical ambition. History, properly understood, is not a series of inevitable outcomes. It is a record of choices made by individuals in circumstances they did not entirely control, with information they did not entirely possess, under pressures that we, looking back from safety and distance, can attempt to understand but can never fully experience. The story of Remagen, and of Schlemmer's decision, is a story about the intersection of structural forces and individual agency. The structural forces are easy to identify: the military might of the Allied nations, the strategic bankruptcy of the Nazi regime, the physical deterioration of the German military, the inevitable logic of a war that had been decided in favor of the Allies at least as far back as the failure of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. These forces were real, and they were powerful, and they were moving in a direction that no single individual could alter. But within those structural forces, individuals still made choices. And those choices mattered. A slightly different demolition system, one that had been more carefully maintained and tested in the weeks before March 7, might have brought the bridge down before Timmerman's men reached it. A slightly more determined German defense at the eastern end of the bridge might have thrown back the assault crossing with heavy casualties, buying the time for the bridge to be properly destroyed. A slightly different decision by Schlemmer, to hold his position, to attempt the manual detonation of any remaining charges, to fight the kind of last-ditch defense his orders called for, might have changed the outcome of the afternoon entirely. The war would still have ended, eventually. The structural forces were too powerful. But it might have ended later. And later meant more dead. This is the profound and uncomfortable truth that the Remagen story forces us to confront: the decisions of individuals in specific moments, even relatively ordinary individuals, even people like a middle-aged Bavarian sergeant without pretensions to heroism, can have consequences that reach far beyond anything those individuals could have anticipated or intended. Schlemmer, ordering his men back through the tunnel, was not thinking about the strategic impact of his decision on the overall course of the war. He was thinking about his men. He was thinking about the bridge in front of him, the American soldiers on it, the calculation of what his continued resistance could realistically achieve. He was thinking, perhaps, about getting home. He was making a practical, human decision in a particular moment, without access to the full information that would have been required to understand its significance. And yet his decision contributed to ending a war. There is something in this that speaks to the nature of moral courage, the kind that does not require certainty about consequences, that does not wait for full information, that operates in the fog and under pressure and with the knowledge that it may be punished. Schlemmer did not know that history would eventually credit his decision as significant. He could not have known. What he knew was what was in front of him, what his conscience told him about what was worth dying for, and what it told him about his responsibility to the men under his command. The story of Remagen is also a story about what war does to ordinary human moral systems. The Nazi regime had spent years building a structure of command and compliance that was designed, above all else, to prevent exactly the kind of individual moral reasoning that Schlemmer exercised on that bridge. It had done so through a combination of ideology, threat, and a bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility that made it difficult for any individual to experience the full moral weight of their contribution to the system's crimes. The genius and the evil of the system was precisely that it could turn ordinary people into instruments of extraordinary harm by distributing that harm across 1,000 small obediences. Remagen is, in this sense, a small and imperfect redemption story. Not because Schlemmer's decision undid any of the larger horrors of the regime he had served, it did nothing of the kind. But because it demonstrated that even within a system specifically designed to eliminate individual moral judgment, individuals sometimes still exercised it. That even in the most extreme institutional environment, there were moments when a person could look at what was in front of them and decide to act on their own assessment rather than on their orders. The Americans who crossed the Remagen Bridge that afternoon understood little of this. They understood that the bridge was there, that they had been ordered to take it, and that they had taken it at considerable risk and personal cost. Some of them would later learn more of the story, would read Heckler's book, or see the film, or hear about Schlemmer's decision from historians. But in the moment, they were simply doing their job, moving fast across a damaged bridge over a cold river, trying not to get killed. That is how history mostly works, at the individual level. Not in grand gestures and fully understood consequences, but in the immediate and the practical and the urgent, with the meaning of what is happening arriving later, if at all. The Remagen Bridge crossed on March 7, 1945. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In between, as we have noted, hundreds of thousands of people died. In between, there was more suffering, more destruction, more loss than any single story can contain. But there was also an ending. And the ending came, in some part, because of what happened at a small German town on the Rhine on a grey March afternoon, when a sergeant decided not to do what he had been told. Let that rest with you for a moment. The individual, within the vast machinery of war and history, is not nothing. The individual makes choices. The choices have consequences. And sometimes, not always, not even often enough, those consequences are of the kind that reduce suffering, that bring things to an end, that allow people to go home. Sometimes a single decision, made in a moment of exhaustion and uncertainty, in the darkness of a railway tunnel on the eastern bank of a cold river, is enough. Let the story settle now, like sediment in still water. Let the names and the bridges and the cold March light drift gently into the background. Tonight you have traveled the length of a war, from its desperate political origins, through the grinding campaigns that brought two exhausted armies to the banks of the Rhine, down to the level of a single man standing in the dark, making a decision that no general had authorized and no order had anticipated. The history of war is, at its deepest, a history of choices. Grand choices made by powerful people in well-lit rooms. And quiet choices made by ordinary people in the dark. Both kinds matter. Both kinds shape what comes next. Johann Schlemmer went home to Bavaria. Karl Timmerman went home to Nebraska. The bridge fell into the Rhine. The river kept flowing, as it has for 10,000 years and more, indifferent to the wars fought on its banks, carrying its cold water northward to the sea. There is something comforting in that, in the continuity of the world beyond the events that seem to consume it. The river flows. The seasons turn. The men who made terrible decisions, and the men who made unexpectedly good ones, and all the ordinary men who simply tried to survive, they all went home, or they didn't, and the world continued. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of the day dissolve from your shoulders and your hands. You are here. You are safe. The river flows. The night is quiet. And somewhere in the accumulation of human choices, good and bad, heroic and ordinary, obedient and quietly, bravely defiant, the world moves, incrementally, towards something better. Rest now. If you're still awake, the battles are over now. Rest easy. Subscribe to Wars and Dusk for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.